Good morning, everybody. We appreciate you being here. I'm Robert Reeves, a Deputy Democratic Leader representing District 54. As you see, we've ended session, and I think needless to say, there are a lot of us that walked out of session very disappointed. We had a lot of opportunities again in this short session to advance North Carolina, to advance the priorities that we all know that we need. We started out this session immediately with the voices of 20,000 teachers coming down here telling us to make public education a priority, asking us for a $1.9 million school bond, asking us to do things not just to support them, to support the infrastructure and to support our citizens. And instead of doing that, what their answer was and what they got was a budget that nobody was involved in. A budget that spent more time trying to figure out how we were going to give more tax breaks to the wealthy, more tax breaks to corporations, and not give us tax fairness for teacher pay, not give us an opportunity to continue to invest in all of our North Carolinians instead of just a short number. Then following that, we got a chance to see what our leadership, what the Republicans felt about certain communities here. When you look at what we had with the budget process again, not one African American in the room, not one person of color in the room to help discuss what those budgeting priorities are going to be. And then as we moved through session, we got to our confirmation processes, which a lot of you had an opportunity to watch yesterday. And to say that that was disappointing would be an understatement. For the first time since I've had a chance to be here, I watched several of our members on the Democratic side almost move to tears as we saw how people were treated all throughout the day. Embarrassed, humiliated, some of the most qualified people that we've had a chance to have on some of our boards and commissions as judges being summarily thrown out, embarrassed, for no other reason than politics. And why is that significant? Because the other thing that we have made a priority this session are pushing through constitutional amendments. Just in this year, we're trying to push through more constitutional amendments than we've probably seen over the last 30 years. And why are we doing that? Well, we don't know, except for what Jim Martin said just recently yesterday, that it looks like a power grab. We've got constitutional amendments that would allow this General Assembly to take over and completely obliterate our separation of powers in the Constitution. They will take over 400 different boards and commissions if given a blank check by the voters of North Carolina. They will take over appointing as many as 40% of our judicial vacancies if given this blank check by the people of North Carolina. And why? Because they ask us, just trust us. And when I say, well, how do you trust? Then the question you've got to ask is what you saw yesterday. Watching those appointment processes yesterday tells you what will happen if they are given blank checks to take over all of these executive functions and continue to make, again in the words of former Governor Jim Martin, the governorship a figurehead position. The bedrock of what we do in this legislature was created with the Constitution. The bedrock of who we are as a nation is created in the Constitution. And the one thing that should be above all politics, Republican or Democrat, is making sure that we make the rule of law what it is, where legislators create laws, where the executive branch executes and the judicial branch interprets. But we spent most of our important point in this session pushing through constitutional amendments that are going to obliterate that, and that what they're hoping will help with their turnout in the fall. So what we're asking at this point in time is why? Why have we not made it a priority to get our $1.9 million school bond that, if you remember, Republicans and Democrats said should be a priority and should be something that we do to help build up our schools? Why are we at a position now where we are further stripping judges? Still running through bills where you're stripping districts, you're changing things around, you're changing the way that we vote, and then taking away things from our voters, taking away opportunities that they should and could have. And I think that's the question you've got to walk out of this session asking, is what is North Carolina going to look like in January 2019 if we continue to give this legislature, as it's constructed, blank checks to to change everything that has meant something from us. All we're asking is to make North Carolina what North Carolina has always been, and that is a beacon in the South, as opposed to an example of what is wrong with government today. What they did to our citizens yesterday, what they've done to our citizens throughout this session cannot be continued to be tolerated. That is why we're all here today. That is why we're here unified. That is why we're asking you to listen, to watch, and to understand what we've done with our government. And if you're asking, well, what the Democrats want to do, you've had a chance to hear that, and you heard that at the beginning of the session with our Carolina Promise. As we rolled that out in 6 different regions throughout this state, what we have made a priority and what it begins and ends with is education, because education is our great equalizer. You have a strong public education system, you'll have strong economic development. You have strong economic development, you've got people working again, you've got people with opportunities throughout this state, and you've got a chance for every citizen, no matter race, creed, color, economic background, to have the ability to advance and make a great life for themselves. And that's what we should be about in this government. It shouldn't be about picking winners and losers. It shouldn't be about trying to figure out how you can help this special interest group over here, this special interest group over here, rushing through legislation without any type of chance for input from the people that it's going to affect. That's not what we're about. What we're about is what we promised you we were about. And so we're hoping that Democrats are paying attention to this. We're hoping that independents and unaffiliated are paying attention to this. We're hoping that Republicans who remember what good government was about are paying attention to this. This is not who we are. This is not what we should be. And we've got to stop being the test ground and the guinea pig for some of the bad policies that you have seen nationwide. Let's advance North Carolina. Let's make North Carolina what it has always been and what it can be. And note, when you start to hear Republican judges, Republican governors, former Republican legislators continue to decry the processes that they've had a chance to watch here, that's when you ought to know that the bell is ringing and we've got a problem. So don't just listen to us, and please don't take this as just partisan politics. The Constitution is all we have to protect our most vulnerable citizens. And if these amendments get passed through, that's going away. And everything and every policy that we have will be passing through these halls upstairs with nobody to do anything to check or to balance or to stop it. Thank you, and we'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
There's no doubt that these amendments shift power. But this argument that it's a power grab, are you going to be able to make that successfully to the exact same voters who are required to vote for the power grab if it is to take place? Does that make sense? I mean,
that makes perfect sense.
If they don't want it, they don't want it.
But they've got to be fully informed of what it is they're voting on. And that's what the big problem is with the amendments. The amendments have been crafted masterfully. But if you listen to the committee reports, if you listen to the debate, one of the things, let's take the last amendment that we were dealing with on 814, where we're talking about the judicial vacancies. And it looks beautiful on paper. Yeah. It looks wonderful. You hear the nonpartisan board and all that stuff. But if you read the legislation, the nonpartisan board, who a lot of us say, if you're going to steal the vote from the voters, if you're going to take voters out of the equation and you want to make a nonpartisan board, then let it actually be a board and commission that does something. That nonpartisan board is nothing but a funnel to just say, this person is a lawyer, this person has not had his or her license suspended, this person has not been convicted of a felony. But then all of those names go up to the General Assembly. Now look at the legislation and say, well, the legislation I'm sure tells us the process for that and all that. Doesn't say a word. All it says is trust us. Trust us as prescribed by law. Look at the voter ID amendment. And if any of you were in the Rules Committee meeting or some of the other meetings that we had regarding that, but I believe this came up in the Rules Committee meeting. The question was asked, doesn't this constitutional amendment allow you to basically put in the exact same law that got thrown out from 2013? What was the answer? Yes. Why would you authorize this General Assembly to write voter ID law in an amendment. Again, if the amendments spelled out and actually locked us into a position, I can't tell you that I would agree. I'm an attorney. I don't believe in amending the Constitution willy-nilly to address particular issues. I think that's what statutes are for. We've got walls full of statute books, and that's what it's for, statutes that have been on the books for 40 years, so you don't have to amend the Constitution. But when you lock it into the Constitution, you have to understand the purpose. One of the things that, again, got discussed about voter ID, because the misconception is people keep saying, oh, well, it's just ID, what's the big deal? It is all about the definition of that ID. That is a huge issue. Because one of the points that was made, and again, this wasn't in a discussion. I want to be fair. This was not in a discussion about what types of ID would be allowed, because nobody wants to have that conversation right now. But one of the things was said in an answer to a question is, for instance, military ID, if we choose to take that as a form of ID. So again, the devil's in the details. All these amendments are doing is saying, give us a blank check to start writing some laws, and then we can point at this blank check and say, hey, you guys told us to do it. You're the voters. You should have not told us to do it. And all that's happening is that. So that's a long answer to a short question. I want to be clear. These amendments do not specify one piece of law. Every single amendment is a general amendment saying, hey, are you okay with this idea? Yes, ma'am.
We asked Speaker Moore this, we'll ask you, why do you think they're coming back in November as opposed to waiting until January?
As prescribed by law.
As prescribed by law. Well, you know, you've got to ask yourself this question, and this came up again in the amendment debate. One of the things that we talked about with voter ID in an amendment that was offered by Leader Jackson, who unfortunately is not able to be here today, is he said, well, if we're serious about voter ID, then won't we let the 2019 legislature handle it? Well, we're not sure that that's the way it should be. I think what is clear is this, is that there seems to be a belief that there may be some change in the election in November. And they want to have an opportunity in November to push through legislation that there will be no way on earth that will get pushed through in January of 2019. And that is, again, disappointing. Because in November, the voters will have made a decision about what direction they want to go. And whichever direction they want to go, the 2019 long session is where new legislation should be done. You should not be coming back in November or December, because the one thing I can tell you, and you've heard me speak before, Laura, about this, I wasn't here back in the old days, but I'm fairly confident there ain't a lot of good legislation that came out of November or December of any lame duck assembly. So,
Best work not done.
yes, sir.
With regard to voter ID and the other election law changes, we saw some people here protesting in the last couple of weeks wanting Amazon and Apple to weigh in on this issue. Do you think those issues should have any effect on those companies' decisions whether they come to North Carolina?
I don't think we have a choice for them to have an effect. That's the problem. Is that whether we say, please have an effect, don't have an effect, the reality is companies like Amazon and Apple are actually good examples. Companies like Amazon and Apple deal worldwide. So when they look at our policies and the way we enact our policies, I can tell you frankly, I've had that conversation not with anybody at Amazon or Apple, but with executives thinking about locating in North Carolina. And one of the things they talk about is they're more worried about our process, even more so than our policies. But Amazon and Apple have espoused a certain belief about how companies should be run, about inclusion, about making sure that all groups are represented. And so if they see legislation, if they see activities that seem to want to exclude people, whatever groups, and understand this is so far now beyond race. If you talk about going back to that budget process again, there were Republicans frozen out of that budget process. This wasn't a situation where you just heard Democrats, and if you had a chance to hear at least one Republican legislator, that person made it clear this is not a process, democratic process even for them. So my point is, you cannot want Amazon and Apple to look at it, but we are the governing body of this state. And if this is how we do business, then how comfortable can a company be? I hope they come, because we need the jobs, we need the innovation, we need the opportunities that Amazon and Apple could give us as a state, and I think it will be a wonderful win for the state, whoever's in charge. But I think you send such a bad message to businesses when businesses look and they don't know if they're going to have a certain rule in place today that they hire people on, that they base their educational policy on, that they base their employment on, and that they're going to wake up in the morning because somebody got a burr in their saddle. and the law is completely changed. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I can point you to a couple of times that's happened. That's a very difficult position for companies. Companies want some type of commitment to education, and they want some type of consistency. Because not only are they hiring people in North Carolina, but they are bringing people that they care about and love to this state. And when you look at a state that just says, again, with the education system, you've got to make an education system that works for everybody. You cannot continue to take tax dollars from people and then take those tax dollars and put them in the institutions that these people can't attend. That's terrible. So yes, it may matter.
There have been a lot of polls over the years that on a general idea of voter ID, there's been a lot of support. I mean, do you think the way that you can defeat it is by kind of just lopping it all with the other amendments and saying, look, they're trying, this is generally a power grab?
Well, and again, I don't like to think in terms of how to defeat it, anything of that sort, and that's kind of messaging. I'm fine if people look at that amendment just as it is and understand that, again, whatever it is you think, what I can promise you, whatever a person thinks about voter ID, this amendment does not reflect that. Because again, what people believe works as ID, obviously 3 separate courts and several attorneys and learned people recognize that 2013 legislation didn't address. So again, I do believe that you've got to look at it in context because these amendments are connected. There are reasons for it. Like again, let's go back to the judicial vacancies amendment. It is an interesting thing that you'll find in that amendment. In that amendment, you see where certain appointments will be 2-year appointments. Well, then you got to ask, well, what's the big deal about it being a 2-year appointment? If we're talking about transparency and making sure that voters have a chance to weigh in, your question is then why would you suddenly extend the time for appointments, even beyond what the governor has the right to do right now? Well, if you put it in context with something that could happen in the November session, like adding 2 justices to the Supreme Court, then suddenly it makes sense. I get to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court, and then I get to turn around and have that person sit for 2 years before they're faced with election results. So I do believe that you've got to put them in context with all of them, but I also believe that they're bad amendments just on their own.
Robert,
Yes.
may I make
Yes.
one clarifying? I just want to point out that on the 913, that amendment, I read what's going to be on the ballot. I read that on the floor. Nowhere in there does it say that that is a constitutional amendment. That's the one that says it's the board's, that's the power grab one. But it does not say to the voters, transparency, that this is yet another constitutional amendment.
Have you all talked about what you'll do in a scenario where voters approve the constitutional amendment on voter ID, but also end up giving you the majority?
Yes, we'll write good legislation.
So you would honor that and still have a
There's
law?
no choice. There's no choice but to honor it and understand that's what, but what you just said, that's what the issue is, and that's what actually Republicans ought to be looking at, is that, that there's enabling legislation that goes along with that, and somebody's going to write that. But a good point that was just made is that's what the problem is with us coming back in November.
Well, the thing is that 589 did, they're gonna put all 589 in that, as prescribed by the General Assembly. If it passes, that's what's going in. 589 is going in there, which sets up everything. And the bad part about that is that in itself discriminates, which sets up more lawsuits, because by the time you leave out certain areas where you have to, or the type of photo ID that you have to have, you got a problem. If you don't recognize state-issued student ID, for instance, that they refuse to look at, or anything like that, you're going to come up with more lawsuits than you can shake a stick at.
And along Representative Michelle's point, that's another problem with the ID as it's written. It says photographic ID.
Yeah.
Whereas we with technology, you talk about Apple and Amazon, Apple and Amazon are moving to everything but photo IDs. You got thumbprints, you got facial, biometrics. You understand that if we vote this in, that suddenly we can't accept those forms of ID. Something that can basically tell you everything about who you are can't be used as ID to go vote. And that doesn't make sense. Why would you lock your Constitution in such a way when all you got to do is write a statute that can then be amended and changed as times change? And despite what some people would like to think, upstairs, times are changing.